there's been one diplomatic drama after another in the run-up to the BRICS Summit in South Africa next month. We clear up some of the confusion with Ms. Sanusha Naidu of the Institute for Global Dialogue. Welcome, Sanusha.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be on BizNews again. Thank you.
Well, there is a great deal of confusion about a number of issues relating to BRICS, and you are in a position to clarify those for us. Shall we start with the BRICS currency, the so-called BRICS currency?
Well, I think, the issue about the BRICS currency is not one that came up in terms of the current context. And I think it was President Lula who made the comment, and President Ramaphosa picked it up at the Paris Summit on new financing mechanisms for development and said, we'll talk about it. I think it's much more complex and much more than just about whether the BRICS countries want to find a reserve global currency. We do know that the BRICS have been talking about this, particularly in the formation of the BRICS in 2009, in the Russian city, which I will not try to pronounce because it's quite difficult to pronounce. But it was a discussion about how do countries of the global south, and in particular countries that are paying a lot of transaction costs when it comes to the currency in terms of what global payments, financial payments, and trade payments take place in, and how that impacts on their financial sovereignty. And 3 countries, Russia, India, and China, and Brazil at the time, were discussing issues around not necessarily replacing the dollar as a global reserve currency, but how do we kind of find ways to mitigate or lessen our financial transaction costs? And so things like the BRICS interpayment settlement system, which was mandated previously, and I think 3 or 4 of the BRICS countries have already signed it and is coming into effect, means that you'll be able to use the ruble, the rupee, the renminbi, the rial, or the rand to transact in terms of trade. One of the newspapers had a very good piece about 2 weeks ago about defining or disaggregating the issue between a reserve currency and a trade currency. And this is what I think is very important for us to understand, because what happens both on the side of official policy, on the side of commentating and other issues, is the question around conflating the BRICS thinking on creating a BRICS currency as a reserve global currency with de-dollarization. It's very difficult. The complexities of what's happening with to take on the argument of de-dollarization suggests that you have to have all things in the perfect storm for this to happen. It can't happen in that way. If you take China, for example, and I say this as the most uninformed person of these issues because I'm not an economist, I'm just picking up on the debates, is if you take China, for instance, to have a de-dollarization in a kind of very layman's term, in my understanding, is it impacts on China's economy, because the Chinese economy is built up in terms of how much of dollar reserves they keep and the credit that they own. So it's going to be complex for us to just suddenly talk about, let's go and just get rid of the dollar. No, it's about reducing your financial transaction costs and the kind of impact it has. It's about finding ways that you could trade and use a payment settlement system in a local currency. And it actually enables you to find ways to not necessarily, I would say, completely remove yourself from the SWIFT payment system or the banking system, but it finds ways to kind of reduce that kind of sanctions that you have. And then the third issue is about using technology. So a cryptocurrency or some kind of tokenism of money, and use that in terms of how do you actually use technological opportunities, blockchain, etc., to start paying. And there are some pilots that are happening with, I think South African Reserve Bank is in one pilot, some of the countries in Southeast Asia in another pilot, of utilizing blockchain technology and other financial technological mechanisms through technological means to start paying. So I think the issue here is not about whether the BRICS countries are going to start thinking about a currency, because putting a third reserve currency into the current global financial architecture is going to be difficult, and it comes with a lot of different kinds of implications and costs that can actually be quite difficult to navigate. The last point I want to make on this is the challenge as well in assuming that the dollar has to be completely removed from the financial system. I think that's a very parochial and a very kind of one-dimensional approach to this. The dollar in itself, if you look at current trends, has diminished in value. Even though it's the global reserve currency that everybody falls back on because it has that level of structural power, it has actually diminished in terms of its value. And you see this in the context of how it impacts on inflation, how information coming out of the U.S. economy will impact on countries where they are linked to the dollar in that way. So, I mean, I think the interdependence of the dollar as well also poses certain important considerations for the BRICS countries to think about, because it cannot be that we enter into a debate based on sound bites and just picking up little, things that we hear here and there and say, well, we need to de-dollarize. At this point in time, I think the BRICS countries, and in particular, the countries that have a significant level of impact if in terms of exposure to the dollar, they're not thinking about that. I think for a country like Russia, it enables them to have more of a need to move away from the dollar because of all of the economic implications that we currently see with the whole sanctions and the trade, and you can't pay, they can't use the dollar in terms of payment as international currency and so forth. And that has significant impacts because of the way in which the financial markets, global financial markets, have been sanctioned through these processes. But I think in other circumstances, for other purposes, for a country like China, it has very real implications in terms of their financial interdependence with the US. And you're consciously seeing this back and flow between Janet Yellen, between different senior policymakers from Washington in China. Recently, you had Anthony Blinken, you had Janet Yellen, and you had John Kerry there. But they're also looking at other issues as well. So I think we've got to be careful in assuming that the summit that's coming up is going to basically make final decisions on things like the dollar question, things around the currency question. Because even if we go back to gold as a reserve currency or fallback currency, which was very much part of international political architecture and economy in after 1945 and thereafter the gold standard, it actually means you're going to be able to have a country like the US is able to absorb dollar purchases. And that's another question. The US structurally can absorb, but also bear in mind that the US is going through serious crisis when it comes to the debt ceiling question. How much does the Congress allow the debt of the federal government to go? And we saw this not so long ago where it had financial impacts, and it has these resounding impacts for the global economy. So I think we've got to temper our thinking right now. We got to be much more pragmatic. We got to think about it in a much more mature way, that it's not something that's just going to happen. It's talk. But I think it's about how do you transact in currencies amongst the BRICS countries in terms of using their local currency for financial transactions and trade transactions.
Another issue that is causing confusion, and there's been much speculation about countries wanting to join BRICS, with some people saying over 40 countries are keen to do so, over 20 have officially applied, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Argentina being the favorites. But what can really happen at this summit as far as expansion is concerned?
So what really happened? Let's contextualize. From the last summit that happened virtually when China was chairing the summit and president of the summit, of the groups rather, that summit, the 14th BRICS Summit, said, we are tasking the summit at the 15th BRICS Summit. We're tasking them, or South Africa, we're tasking with this responsibility to find out how do we develop a criteria for expansion. So in other words, you got to separate the BRICS group as an expansion of the 5+ to expanding to whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's Thailand, whether it's Nigeria, a whole lot of groups, the countries that and the Gulf states that have actually kind of put their hand up and said, we want to join the BRICS. So there's the BRICS group, the countries that make up the group itself, and those are the 5 countries. And then there's membership into the BRICS Development Bank, the new development bank. Now that's already set up. Now, that keeps 55% controlling interest of the 5 core countries, which is Brazil, South Africa, India, China, and Russia. So as long as that treaty that governs the development bank has 55% controlling interest, and they are the core decision makers in the bank, you can bring in new members, and new members have joined. Like I think Saudi Arabia has joined, and so forth. But what's interesting is that they will not have controlling interest over the 5 core members, but they can actually be members of the bank. So you've got to keep those two separate, because there's the bank, and then there's, of course, there's the core. Now, when it comes to the expansion of the actual BRICS group itself, like we talk the G7 or we talk another intergovernmental group, this is where the real issue of understanding what a criteria will be in enabling for a country to join. Now, the South African government, together with their BRICS counterparts, have been discussing this in the last 12 months, since the last summit, where the I think it was the summit, the 14th summit in the declaration said that the 15th summit must come up with some kind of framework. At the last, I'm not sure, the Sherpas meeting that happened in I think about 3 or 4 weeks ago in Durban, but at the foreign ministers meeting in June in Cape Town this year, if you listen to Minister Pandor's press briefing, as well as Foreign Minister Jay Shankar from India, one of the things that's interesting is that, and even the Brazilian foreign minister, all of them kind of agreed that it's a work in progress. That at this summit, you still have to think about what's going to be endorsed and what's going to be taken forward. And the sense one gets is that right now, they're still deciding on what will be the consensus, not necessarily the criteria already decided, what will be the consensus on the criteria for enabling other countries to join an expanded BRICS group. And that, I think, is interesting because it tells you that you have to find that common agreement amongst the 5 core members, the nucleus countries that make up the BRICS. And obviously, there are challenges if you're going to just open it up without necessarily having criteria, framework, principles, maybe best practice, looking at other regional organizations or other organizations that have had a kind of, not a quick kind of approach, but a staggered approach to expansion. And this is what's coming out in terms of whether this 15th BRICS Summit will endorse an expansion, or would they say, and I said, I strongly feel, and I could be completely wrong here, so when you come back to me after the summit and say, Sanusha, you got it wrong, I'll say, yes, I'll give you that. I have a feeling that, I'm leaning towards the fact that they will say that there needs to be continuous discussion on this, continuous engagement, interaction, that we still have to think about the expansion in terms of what constitutes a criteria. Should the countries have a particular GDP output? Should they be at a particular level in terms of their GNP? All of these kind of technical details that will enable for the criteria to be met. And so I think we're going to have, and also bearing in mind that at the foreign ministers meeting, a press briefing, it was noted that the New Development Bank has also been tasked with investigating and going forward on these things. So I don't think we're going to have a decision at the summit to say that we've decided unanimously that this is the criteria, and so we're going to get countries to come in. I think they're going to say we're still giving it due consideration and engagement in order to effect a much more agreeable and a consensus around the criteria, because it's a big step for the BRICS to start expanding. There are challenges. There are questions about which countries would want a kind of expedited expansion of the BRICS, which countries are still more hesitant or cautious, I would say, that don't want it to happen as fast as a rollout, because there will be implications for what it means, because it does mean that in terms of diplomacy, in terms of aligning, you may find that this now makes the BRICS less of the 4 of the 5, and it actually opens up different issues in terms of maybe an expanded membership may lead to China having a little bit more leverage over the BRICS than the other countries, or Russia having a little bit, or South Africa may be very concerned about what does this mean for South Africa if, for example, we have countries in the continent that join. How does this play out with my strategic orientation in the BRICS? So I think it's been giving it's something that the media is trying to play a role in, to say that it's a done deal, but it's not a done deal from what I can see and what I sense. It's something that will have, I think countries like India and Brazil will think about this much more strategically in terms of what will the impact be. So I think there's a general consensus in principle by the BRICS countries that an expansion is a consideration. But I think that the criteria is something that they need to have very clear understanding on in terms of how it will be implemented in practice. And one last point, Chris, is the fact of the matter is that, expansion also can't happen if the BRICS is in itself as the inner core, the 5 core countries, don't necessarily have an institutional architecture for themselves. So how do they underpin their cooperation, their collaboration, their interactions, their engagements? So that kind of coordination of their relationship as the core also needs to be thought of in a much more coherent, in a much more cohesive way before you can start thinking about expansion.
Okay, so what you're saying is people have unrealistic expectations that a new world order will be created at this summit, with de-dollarisation being decided on and new members like Iran, the UAE and Argentina being inducted.
Well, I think one of the things, I want to say it's unrealistic expectations. I think the expectations are reacting to a situation where the world's international architecture is in a state of flux. We use terms like unpredictable, volatile, ambiguous, uncertain in political risk analysis, or we talk about the fact that the world is very much now, in a state of unpredictability, that you can't really see where the anchor of the global architecture and the global governance system is, the challenge of the UN security, the UN system, the fact that is the UN system being weakened? Is the Security Council still, relevant? I mean, there's been an argument that I heard recently that reforming or a BRICS expansion would actually make the UN irrelevant in that sense, in a sense where it will actually challenge the question of the reforming of the UN, because the UN in itself needs to find its strategic ambit and anchor itself once again as this intergovernmental body around the architecture of the global system. So I think on the one hand, the idea that there's a wave of changing or the international system is moving to some kind of serious reflection and serious introspection of what a world order looks like moving forward. And I think the whole kind of crisis around Ukraine, Russia, the challenges of climate change, the whole dynamic of the global international architecture, compounded by the impact of the pandemic, essentially doesn't necessarily give the kind of sense that the current status quo of the world order is sustainable or viable going forward. So the idea that the BRICS can offer that kind of momentum of a new world order or a transformed, I wouldn't say a new world order, I would say a transformed world order. I think it's important to raise that. But the expectation that the BRICS is going to do it at this summit, or it's going to happen as the BRICS got some kind of magic wand and whatever, I want to say you have to be tempered. You have to look at the dynamics as well, because if you're talking about this a global system that needs a transformation, but the challenge of the transformation is that, as history has shown us, whenever change is imminent upon us, it always comes with conflict first, and that is the dynamic of where the world order has worked. The international system, in my opinion, hasn't really necessarily been built for peace. It's been built for the fact that change comes with conflict. So if there's an imminent need for change, there's almost a conflict that underpins that need for the change to happen. And I think these are the challenges. So the expanded BRICS doesn't necessarily neutralize or disable the dynamics of a global order that is fundamentally built in a conflictual way.
Lastly, the non-attendance of Russian President Vladimir Putin has overshadowed many issues surrounding BRICS. It's time to move on, isn't it? It's not going to make a difference.
Listen, I mean, it's been the issue that has detracted from what and deflected from what the summit was supposed to be talking about. It's made South Africa's chairship of the BRICS not about the BRICS, but about whether we are abiding by international law, obligations under our domestication of the Rome Statute, whether our foreign policy is in a state of complete disarray and in a complete state of crisis, whether we have the right foreign policy identity, our orientation. Let me put it in a nutshell, as somebody said in a conversation. South Africa has taken a lot of body blows on this issue, and those are not my words; it's somebody else's words. And I think to a large extent, you almost heard the audible sigh of relief when the presidency was announcing that President Putin is not going to be attending the BRICS Summit. And I think, we have to go back to the fact that the BRICS is not about just one particular actor or leader. And it's about the fact that these countries have so vision in themselves. So I think the fact of the matter is, no matter how much you want to use the narrative to make it about something else, let me put it to you this way. Russia is not the BRICS and BRICS is not Russia. And that will apply to all of the other countries if there's something there. And I think that's what the bigger challenge is in how global debates and narratives and commentaries have focused on this. Because every commentary will say something like, now that Putin is not coming, or South Africa was basically not sure. They were leaning towards still inviting Putin. Diplomacy is a very complex world. If you don't understand how diplomacy works, you have to understand that these things all happen in contextual environments sometimes that's not always privy to the outside world. And so I think at this point in time, we now must get back to the business of BRICS. President Putin is not coming. He will have his foreign minister represent him. I'm sure he will be online because the BRICS have had the virtual conference happening because of the COVID-19. This is the first time they're going to meet in person. And I think to a large extent, you're not going to find that the BRICS is going to basically now suddenly implode because this is the situation. I think they've got much more to lose if it implodes and much more vested interest to let it strengthen and continue. So obviously there's going to be challenges around some of the issues, but I think going forward, I think the BRICS will, from my perspective, you can't actually ignore it. So I think the reason why we have so much of, and this may be a bit of a controversial point, and I may get a bit of backlash on this, is I think the reason you have so much of attention to the BRICS is because when it's not an issue or it doesn't actually threaten the status quo, you won't give it attention. But if it's something that's going to challenge the status quo, you give it a lot of attention.
Indeed. That was Ms. Sanusha Naidu of the Institute for Global Dialogue, clearing up some of the confusion around the upcoming BRICS Summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much.